Hi, I'm Ken White. I'm the lead pastor of Forest Park Covenant Church, and we're here with a couple of great people from Fresh Coast Ministry. You'll learn a little bit about them, but in this podcast on mission, we're trying to hear about the ministries not only that we support, but also the ways in which people in our church are doing ministry. And so it's just my great pleasure to welcome Joyce Sparks and Saulo Montalvo from Fresh Coast Ministry. And before we dive into that, it'd be great if we just had a little kind of taste of your life. So Joy, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for having us.
Yeah.
I'm actually born and raised in Muskegon. So the Lakeshore is close to my heart. I spent about 20 years working in education and really felt called to work in inner city schools. So I taught here in Muskegon Heights for many years and then over on the west side of Grand Rapids at Union High School. And then I guess it was about 10 years ago, I really just felt a call to prison ministry. And around that same time, Fresh Coast Alliance was launching. We were at the very first fundraiser, my husband and I. And the joke is that we wrote a check that night. And then we've just personally been sponsors of Fresh Coast that entire time. And so when the director position came up about a year ago, I just really felt that this was something that God had for me. So so just really passionate about those returning from incarceration and then also the addiction side of things too.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specific ministry of Fresh Coast. Saulo, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So I've been at Fresh Coast a relatively short time, since November. Before that, I worked in Grand Rapids in a homeless shelter, which I think very much prepared me for this work. But before that, I was incarcerated for 23 years. I went into prison when I was 16 years old with life. And God, through his grace and mercy, gave me a second chance, and I was resentenced and given a chance for parole.
Yeah.
And I've been off parole now for about a year and a half, and I've been able to find my way to Fresh Coast and do the work that I'd always dreamed of doing while I was in prison. And just wondering what God may have for me if I were to ever get out.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't supposed to. But God just through time, changing me, changing my heart, and also reconciling me with the family of the man that me and my two friends at, 16 years old, whose life we murdered. And, so just being able to receive that forgiveness, just so much of his goodness, in my life and mercy, and to be here and be able to give back in this way, is huge.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you saying it, Sal. We're going to come back to your story and hear a little bit more about it, but it'd be good to just sort of rewind a little bit and ask, describe, if you can, the ministry of Fresh Coast and what you're doing. So Joy, could you describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of say two different things. One is we have a holistic approach. So when someone's coming out of incarceration, jail or prison, coming out of addiction, they really need all of the services, right? Like when I'm starting my life over, there's a lot of things that I need. So we treat the whole person, and we do that from a wraparound services. So we have everything from, we own our own therapy practice. So we have master's level social workers that can provide mental health therapy, substance use disorder therapy. We have housing that is probably still, always has been, one of the biggest needs when you're starting your life over, is a place to live, a safe place where I can lay my head at night. We have groups where we teach different life skills, and then recovery groups, of course. We have peer recovery coaches, and then people like Saulo, right, who've walked this path so they can meet with our participants and coach them. What else? We do job training. We have a lot of business partners in the community.
And Saulo, what's your
everything?
So, would you each say what your job title is or what your role is at Fresh Coast?
Yeah, I'm the director of operations and housing at Fresh Coast. So I kind of oversee all of our houses, make sure that they are ready and able to pass inspection through the city or through MAR or what have you, and then working with our house managers as well. Who live in each house. So each house has a house manager who oversees the program participants in each one. And so I oversee them also.
I see. Okay. And Joy, what's your role?
I'm the executive director, so I get to make sure everybody else does what they're supposed to do.
Big
No,
boss.
it's
You're like the conductor of the orchestra.
I think so.
Yeah.
No, and honestly, I mean, being at this level of leadership is new to me. And so I'm just really leaning into mentors that I have in the community and just I kind of live by the motto of I don't have it all figured out and I don't expect everyone else to, but man, God has called us to something so great and we get to help people every single day. So
Yeah. So you were talking about being at the first fundraiser. So what drew you into Fresh Coast Ministry from the beginning?
I have a connection to someone who worked for Prison Fellowship. And actually, before I came to Fresh Coast, I worked at Prison Fellowship for a few years. And so I was invited into prison to sit in on a class. And the truth is, I went because I'm nosy. I said, who doesn't want to see the inside of a prison? And so I said yes. I was a teacher at the time and they were doing classes. And so I sat in a room. It was a day room in a housing unit and there was a facilitator teaching the class. And I bet it wasn't 2 minutes before I felt the Lord tapping me on the shoulder. And we began to have an argument of, do I really look like I need to be hanging out in prison? I am not. I'm a female. It's a male prison. Like, this isn't really for me. And by the time I drove home that day, I had a very clear direction from the Father of this is what you're supposed to do. And so I started volunteering. And then, of course, right away, you see people that are paroling and coming home and all the needs that they have. And so it was just a natural... I was kind of known as someone who had volunteered in prison. So I got the invite to the very first fundraiser.
Yeah. And Saulo, how did you come into your engagement with Fresh Coast?
Yeah, well, after leaving the mission in Grand Rapids, I just felt like God was telling me that my time there was done. And so, and my wife also had worked there at the time. And she left, and then shortly after I left there as well. And I started just asking God, like, I didn't know where to go. I just knew that wasn't where he wanted me anymore. And ironically, Joy approached me with the opportunity, and she could probably speak on that a little more. But
I can't wait.
I was very, very excited for it because, again, like I mentioned, this was something that was so dear to me. I mean, I remember sitting on the yard while I was in prison in Muskegon, here in Muskegon, at Brooks Correctional Facility. And there was a section in the fence where you could see people walking by, cars driving by, and I used to sit on the little picnic table right there that faced that direction. And you know, like I would often do, just, you know, praying and just imagining like what it would be like to be out there again. Because at this time I was probably late 20s, early 30s, after going into prison at 16. And so, I mean, I really didn't even remember what being on the other side of that fence felt like anymore.
Yeah.
You know, it was something I just couldn't even fathom anymore. And so, just, you know, imagining what it would be and what I would do, you know, if God allowed me another chance. And it was something that weighed on my heart so much, was to work with people who were formerly incarcerated, who had the same experience I did. And so for me, it was like a prayer, like answered, and, you know, just God's mercy and grace and goodness to me to present me with this opportunity. Because I didn't really feel like it would ever happen. Yeah. You know, and so.
And how did Joyce? So you said, I can't wait to say. So late. Tell us about that.
It's funny looking back. And I really think it was almost a year ago. Like I feel like it was last February. We knew that we needed somebody to run housing and operations. We didn't know that we quite had the budget for that yet, which we really didn't. But so I started making some calls. I reached out to someone that works in the reentry community and just said, hey, throw me some names. If it's a return citizen, that's really who we want. And so I'll tell you, it was Nick Nichols, who was one of your classmates at Calvin. Saulo went through the Calvin Prison Initiative through Calvin University when he was in prison, got some education. And so this gentleman said, "Do you know Saulo?" And I said, "I don't." And so I got his number, and then I reached out. We had a conversation. Saulo started showing up at Fresh Coast, which I thought was just a great, it just seemed like humility to me. Like, I'm going to sit in these groups because like I can use your services too. I'm a return citizen. And he didn't think he was better than anybody. It just really spoke to me. And then I can't tell you how many different people the name kept coming up. "Well, have you talked to Saulo? Do you know Saulo?" And can I tell him the whole truth? I felt like Saulo was a little too nice to be in this role. And I finally ended up, it's hilarious now looking back, because he can hold his own. But
I thought you were going to say he's really not nice.
No. We have to be able to hold our people
Maybe
accountable.
the term
right?
is more like pushover.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what
you got an
he's looking
edge.
for.
I thought he was sweet. That's the story. And so when the last person, she was the director of the Calvin Prison Initiative. This was in September. So think February to September. God's like beating me over the head with this guy. And I'm like, no, I don't think he's the guy. Like, he's really great. But anyway, when Carrie Bosma said, "Have you talked to Saulo?" I said, "Okay, fine." And so we had another conversation, and I just said, "Saulo, I think you're too nice." And he said, "Oh no, that's not the case." And it has been just an unbelievably fantastic journey. I mean, he's exactly who we need.
Yeah. What's interesting, as you were talking, there's a level of self-awareness that I think that has been talked about by yourself and by Joy. So I think that has something to do with your story. So it would be really not just interesting, but very helpful for people to understand what it means to be a returned citizen. So I wonder if you could just, from the beginning, tell your story about how you ended up being imprisoned and what the process was of sentencing and then being in prison for 23 years and being released and that whole story.
Okay, well, hopefully we have more than a half hour.
We have endless tape.
No, so like I mentioned, at 16, I went into prison. And I think what kind of facilitated that was, I grew up in a broken home. There was mental abuse, physical abuse. And I was just I grew into a really angry teenager. I remember, I think my breaking point as a teenager at 15, I was walking home, and it was late at night. Earlier that day, I'd gotten kicked out of school for, getting into a fight in gym, and that I started because I was just angry, and I was always looking for a way to take my anger out on other people. And so I was walking home, and as I approached my house, my mom and my dad were on the porch arguing, and they were arguing about who was going to take me. And I heard each of them say, "Well, I don't want him. He can't live with me." And, for me, that cut me really deeply. Mm-hmm. And so I became very bitter and resentful towards them. And I remember my dad, he got angry and he got in the car and left. And at this time, they were divorced already. And I remember as I went to go inside, my mom was standing there in the door, and she just made this comment that I think just kind of pushed me over the edge. And she was like, she said that you're the reason me and my dad can never get along. And I think for me, in my immature 15-year-old mind, I took that to mean like every moment that I witnessed you two arguing, my dad throwing something, like all of this, the times that you guys separated, all of that was somehow like my fault, right? And so I took that and I became so bitter and I hated them. And so at that point, I left home, and I just started like couch surfing, living with friends, things like that. And with friends that I eventually, one night, after about a month of planning, we robbed a store, and murdered the clerk in that store. And we were arrested the next day, we're locked up in jail with adults. So in the 90s at that time, Michigan had passed laws that automatically waived juveniles to be tried and sentenced as adults. And so there was no juvenile facility. There was none of that. It was just straight to adult jail and then to prison. And I remember when I was getting sentenced, and I grew up in a Christian. My parents were Christians. As dysfunctional as they were, one thing that they were very good at doing was regularly having Bible study and worship and things like that in our home. And I actually, I went to a Christian school. We were poor, but they found a way to send me and my brother and sister to a private Christian school. So I knew about God. I knew, I believed he was real, but I was never in the place where I wanted to dedicate myself to him. And I think part of that was just because I was angry. I was angry at him. I was angry at my parents. I was just angry at everyone. And I remember, though, God just humbling me, in the county jail and through the process, the 10 months that I waited to go to trial. And the moment that I was getting sentenced, they brought me back briefly into a holding cell by myself. And I just felt so desperate because I was finally understanding the consequences of what we had done. And that would be the rest of my life in prison, and literally the rest of my life, meaning I would grow up, I would grow old, and I would die in prison. And I cried out to God. I remember getting on my knees in front of this concrete bench with a Bible, and all I knew is I needed to hear something from God. I needed to know it would be okay. And I was crying and praying, and I opened my Bible. I didn't know where to go, what to read, and it fell open to Psalm 27, and so I started reading that. And it wasn't until the last two verses where God just kind of arrested my attention, and I had this peace, and I knew, like, in this moment, God was talking to me. And it said, "For I am still confident of this, I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." And I took that as his promise to me that I wouldn't die in prison. And it gave me hope. And over the years of prison, it gave me hope. When I was losing that hope and I was starting to slip away and I was starting to give in to despair, God would bring that back to my remembrance. And he would do that in so many different ways. Like, just randomly, I remember one time where, again, I was struggling with being there. And this is after probably some years of being inside. And just hoping, because it's like after a while, you hope, and years just start clicking by. And it's like, man, maybe this was just in my head. Maybe I just made this up. Right? Maybe it wasn't really God speaking to me, and I remember I was doing pull-ups on the yard, and a guy just randomly walked up to me, and he was like, "Prayer is going to bring you home. God told me to tell you that." And it's funny because not too long ago, I went to a Bible study at a church in Grand Rapids, and it was full of about 75 people in there, all of whom had prayed for me to come home for years. And as I was giving my testimony and I was talking, it kind of dawned on me. And I told them too, like, I'm sitting here and I'm giving you my testimony, but really this testimony is yours because I am the product of your prayer and your faithfulness. And I just remembered that guy coming up to me and saying that to me. Prayer is what's going to bring you home, And so I look at it and it's like, all right, another part of that promise that God made to me that I didn't realize until I was home already 23 years later was that, he also said that I would see his goodness in the land of the living. And I look back at the time that I was in prison, in spite of like the mistakes, because I wasn't perfect. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes. God had a lot of work to do in me, and he still does. But, I made mistakes that could have jeopardized my freedom, my chance. And in spite of that, though, God opened so many doors and showed me so much grace where I could attend TUMI, which is the Urban Ministry Institute through Prison Fellowship. It's kind of an unaccredited seminary for 3.5 years, and I took that and graduated that. Yeah. And then to attend the CPI program, the Calvin Prison Initiative, to earn a bachelor's degree, to be able to do that. And then for God to allow me to discover talents, like singing and playing guitar and leading worship, which I did for 9 years in prison. And so to give me purpose and to give me favor and to show me so much goodness like that I didn't deserve, and then to allow me to reconcile with the family of the man that me and my 2 friends murdered, and to develop a relationship with them even. To see them on a visit and to talk to them on the phone and to hear them say that we forgive you. Mm-hmm. Like all of these things, like just so much that he did, and because he made a promise and he kept his promise, and so it's because of that I'm here. Yeah. Eventually I was resentenced from natural life to 25 to 60 years in prison. And even though I still had a parolable life sentence, I had essentially a commutation. I had to go to a public hearing, and I was still released. And I've been home now 5 years, a little over 5 years.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of directions and a lot of questions. Here's one question, just so you're released. Mm-hmm. Can you describe the first day, the first week? Like what was it like coming out of prison?
It was overwhelming. I think that more so than perhaps somebody who went to prison as an adult and then served some time and then came home, because it was all I knew. I grew up there, right? Like all the years where perhaps most teenagers, they develop their self-identity and all of that, while going, to high school, right? Learning how to communicate. Yeah. And, I didn't have any of that. There was so many missing pieces to my development that it was very challenging. And I think while initially I was very eager and I had imagined so many things of what life would be like once I came home, my heart was broken and I became very disillusioned because it was so hard. It was such a struggle, the readjustment. And because it was like leaving one culture and going to a whole new culture. Yeah. There was so much that I didn't understand, so much that I couldn't, the world I knew as a teenager and was nothing like what I faced when I came home. And then moving from that prison culture to, this culture outside of the walls was vastly different there as well, right? And I'm talking even in terms of like faith, right? In the church, like it's different, right? Like you have, I feel like God gives those behind the walls grace. And I know I was able to go inside of MCF recently and kind of give my story and talk a little bit with the guys there. And one thing that I felt impressed by God to really touch on was situational ethics, right? Where certain circumstances can shape how we view God and how we practice our faith, right? And our view of theology and things like that. And so which we don't have time to get all that stuff. But that in itself, right, created some hardship for me as well, because I had to re-examine my faith and my outlook in terms of where God had showed me grace in areas, perhaps because of where I was at, because of the dangers I faced, because of all these things. Now I was moving into a new area, a new stage of life, and I needed to forget those things. He needed to work those things out of me, right, through that process of sanctification, and straighten some things out in terms of my relationship with him and how I viewed him, and his desire for us to be holy, right, to stop making certain compromises. And so he had to straighten some, and that was a hard lesson for me to learn as well, because I was out and I made mistakes. And I think even in that, the desperation and the pain that I felt, because there were times where I wanted to go back to prison. That's how hard it felt to me. I even had times where I contemplated taking my life, because then I hated prison too. So it's like, well, what do I do? I wanted to go back to the familiar, but I hated that.
Yeah. And if I'm doing my math right, you were sentenced around 1996?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so all you have to do is kind of go back in time and realize, like, the iPhone doesn't come into being until 2008.
Right.
And this is kind of a funny thing, but we have a lot of we have an older church and we have a younger church, and people who are on the older side when it comes to technology. Mm-hmm. There's an open question about whether they're going to accept it or not, and it's not easy. It's hard. All kinds of change. So all kinds of changes are hard.
Yeah.
But you went from not just that. That's a kind of a small cultural change compared to what you did, which was a seismic change from one culture to another.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Joy, I think you've probably seen this kind of transition for a number of different people right over the years. And
sure.
I'm sure this reflects accurately, obviously, but what has been your experience of observing this from a person who's trying to help with a person in recovery and reentry?
As far as Saulo's ability to do that?
As far as Saulo, how does this relate to other situations that you've seen? Sometimes easier, sometimes harder.
Yeah. So, I guess I would say overall, the longer the time incarcerated, the harder the transition. And then as Saulo mentioned, also the younger that you went into prison, the harder it is.
Yeah.
And so, there's funny things that we talk about. There's one gentleman, he did, I think, 39 years in prison. And when he was using a restroom and the toilet flushed automatically, it just absolutely terrified him and flipped him out. Right. So, it's like small things like that to I don't know how to use a debit card or a credit card because I used to hand it to the cashier and what is happening, or even just the fact that we don't use cash very often in our society. So things like that. But what I've seen is we just have to be patient with people, right? It's a process. I know a guy who it's again a juvenile lifer. That's kind of the phrase that we use in society for somebody who went to prison under 18 and then is coming home. It's a process of, we don't want them to work initially, right? Don't come home and we're going to put you in a job. You just have to sit down for a minute. And the biggest thing I've seen is you just have to be patient. The biggest obstacle is tell me if you agree, being patient with yourself. And you said it, I have all these things that I was sitting at the picnic table watching life go by, and I want to do all these things. So everybody wants to hit the ground running. I want to get a job. I want to be able to provide for myself. I want to get a license. I want to get a car. I want to get a girlfriend. I want to have a relationship, and they want to fast forward everything. And so we've seen some people bump their head a few times.
Yeah. And Saulo, I imagine there were turning points or a turning point. So what began the process of moving you toward, into the world that we're in right now? What was helpful for you?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was having people around me to help me, right? At times where I just isolated myself, I think early on I found myself starting to drink heavily, to medicate myself, And I started neglecting relationships. I started the people close to me, and just isolating myself, not wanting to be around anyone anymore, and not wanting to, because I was giving up. And I didn't want to listen to anyone. I had so much despair and so much disillusionment and wondering why God let me out. Why for this?
Yeah.
I was happy inside leading worship and doing the things I was doing, only to come home to this. It's kind of like the Israelite journey out of Egypt kind of situation,
Yeah.
where that syndrome, I guess you would call it, I felt like I was kind of falling into the same thing, looking back at what was comfortable to me and not having in that moment the ability to look at what God had in store, right? And especially based on everything that he had done up to that point, and so, I had people praying for me because I wouldn't listen to them. And I remember there was a moment where, I wanted to end everything. And I felt like I was preparing myself for that. That it was all of a sudden, like God just kind of, I don't know how to explain it, just like woke me up, and I think that started a turnaround in a process of kind of restoring hope, freeing me from the despair, and I felt like the self-destruction that was like pulling me down.
Yeah. It's interesting to me how despair can be so destructive, not just for a person who's coming out of prison, but from anybody that I've ever met. And so just to kind of go fast forward a little bit, just because of what Joy said about she thought you were too nice. Here's a question I have for you. Like, can you remember that moment and what you were thinking when she says, "Oh, you're too nice," and your response is like, "No." What did you hear, and what did you think about that moment?
Well,
we were on the phone, remember?
Yeah, and I just don't know. It kind of threw me a little bit because I feel like, for me, it's important, just to be polite and respectful to people, and so it just kind of threw me off. Like I just couldn't help but think like, I'm not like a mean person or nothing like that, but, I feel like especially being at, when I worked in the mission and having the position I had there, I overseen roughly 58 employees. And so, when I left there, a lot of them were very, they sent me texts and messages, right? Because one thing they noted was, and they commented on, was that they liked that I was always consistent. Like I wasn't like mean, and then I was always fair, but I was also very, like I had my expectations, and that's, they knew what to expect in terms of, their performance, right? Things like that. And, I held people accountable, and I did those things, and I showed grace, and so for me, I'm just thinking when she's saying that, I'm just kind of reflecting like, I don't know. I don't see myself as being a pushover or something like that, right. But I can understand because it's a big deal because you're working with people who are addicts and, or recovery and who are coming out of prison. And again, right, they can be manipulative and, try to get as much as possible. It's kind of that state of survival, thing, right? The mindset. And so it's easy, it can be easy for people to take advantage, right?
Yes.
Whenever they can. And so I can understand the concern, and so, but yes.
Yeah. Well, it's in our world, it's a way of sort of navigating through the way in which we relate to people. So, I mean, all of us have had people say good things about us. You're nice. Like people might say to me, you're quiet. Like some people have said, you're kind of a quiet person. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, I don't know why you say I'm not a quiet person. Because what I'm hearing is you're shy. I'm like, I'm not shy. it's all of that other kind of
Yes.
stuff that's going on. And it's really, I think it's really speaks to you. Because nice is a huge compliment to people, because people aren't generally,
Right.
Nice. It has something to do with kindness and gentleness and humility and things like that.
Yes.
So,
For sure.
here's a kind of bringing us back to Fresh Coast. So you're in the recovery and reentry. That's sort of what I took away from our time with you. What would you say are some of the big opportunities that Fresh Coast has in the next year for ministry or along that, or anything that you actually want to speak to?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you, because, Forest Park has been invested in Fresh Coast for years and years and years. And, of course, financially invests in us, which is just really, really important. But of course, the other ways that you show up, you bring your entire staff to tour our facility and spend a couple hours. I mean, that means the world to us, because that means you care and you see value in the work that we do. So, and then, shout out to the team that came and redid all of our landscaping last spring. Yeah. Hey, Luke's over there. He did it. He was one of the ones. And so, just things like that they just mean so much. And not to get off on a huge tangent, but just when I took this role, I felt like God was really impressing on me that something that had been maybe neglected at Fresh Coast was the relationship with the local church. And so that was something that I was very passionate about, very prayerful about, very intentional about. And so that's something that we really, we value. We want it to be a mutual relationship. You do some wonderful things for us, but we also want you to know that if you have somebody who is struggling with addiction in your congregation, or you have somebody who walks in off the street who just got out of prison and they don't know where to go. You don't do that every day, but we do. And so I would hope, my prayer for anybody in Muskegon County, any church member, any business, that they would know that they could come to us. Maybe you have an employee, you own a business, and you have an employee that is using actively, like, how can we help? And so we just want to be a good community partner. Yeah. I would say probably the biggest thing that you could do right now is we have a comedy night, sober comedy night, coming up on March 6th. It is our one big fundraiser of the year. It's down at Fricano's on the lake. And we would love it if you would just buy a ticket and come hang out.
Well, and we'll put a link on it. Here,
awesome.
A QR code, it'd probably just show up right where my finger is, hopefully, magically. But we'd love to be able to support that. Great.
Yeah, for sure.
Other opportunities that you see coming up, Saulo?
Wow. We have houses, and we have need for people to help. There's so much. I've been doing a lot of maintenance in houses, as limited as I can do. And so, but I know there's people that God has gifted with, gifts for various things, and that could contribute and help us just provide a better experience for so many people in our programs.
Yeah. How many houses do you guys manage again?
5.
Yeah, we visited last week. Partly, you were saying earlier that you were nosy, which I thought was like, we have another word for that. It's called curiosity. And one of the things that I've discovered, is that to be on site is different than like reading a brochure. So us coming on site was revelatory. Both in terms of being able to sit in on a group meeting. That's always just like, people are saying things in those group meetings that are, they can be said anywhere, but you just don't hear the things that are being said. Right. And then going over to the houses and just seeing how nice they are. And then for us to realize from you guys, that there was nobody, you don't have a regular maintenance person, that would be an opportunity. Maybe there's some people out in our world that would have that. You're going to be coming and sharing in our service. Cindy, right, is going to come? Candy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and Saulo.
Candy and Saulo are going to come and just share a little bit, and we'll give some people some more opportunities to just know about that. So those are great opportunities and challenges. Any other things that you wanted to mention?
I just would say that every Tuesday and Thursday at lunchtime, we serve a community meal. So we have a group like that you and the team attended. Every Tuesday, Thursday, the groups are from 11 to 1, and then we have a community meal at 1 o'clock. That's open. So, I mean, if anybody wants to just pop in, like the groups are all open groups. You can sit in on a group, join us for lunch, because I think it's true. If you get in our building and you sit and eat lunch next to our people, like it just feels different. And who knows what God will be calling you to do, as far as, again, I went to prison because I was curious, right? Not nosy. But maybe you stop into Fresh Coast just to check out what's going on. And who knows if you're like an HVAC person or an electrician or a handyman, hey, even better.
It's a tremendous ministry. And I'm really proud that, you guys are working in that. I'm proud that the community has a ministry like that, and working with people that Jesus directly commands us to work with. Yeah. So I'm really, really glad for that. And we look forward to our continued partnership with you and in the near future. So thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Appreciate it.
Now we're going to keep talking.
Okay.
Anything else as we're talking? Like sometimes I lead us down a particular pathway, and you're like, "Oh, I wish you'd ask me this question," and you didn't. Why didn't you ask me that question?
Oh, I don't feel that way. The one thing that it never hit me until we were sitting here today and you were sharing your story. I just have such a soft spot for Saulo, and I'm hearing you share, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, because you were 16 years old, you could have been one of my students, right? And and I saw that happen with my students when you teach in underprivileged areas. Like there's a lot of things. I mean, I regularly walk across the prison yard and someone yells, "Hey, Miss Sparks, you were my 9th grade teacher," and I'm like, yeah. But so it just touched me in a different sort of way. That's deep.
And going back to what's your relationship like with your parents right now?
Oh, yeah, we were talking about that earlier. And, there was a point where God dealt with me in regards to my anger, which stemmed from that, which I didn't realize. Right? I had so much anger all the time, and it would really heavily influence some of my decision making, and I remember one day I was in my early 30s, and I was coming in from the yard, and I was telling you this story, and there was an officer who said something to me. It was very offensive. I can't remember what it was, but it made me so angry. I went up to my cell, and I got a lock and a belt, and I was going to use it to assault him. And as I was about to step out of my cell, another juvenile lifer happened to just be walking past my door, and I stopped and hesitated so not to run into him. And he stopped, and he looked down at what was in my hand, and he said, "Bro, think about what you're about to do, man." And then he kept walking, but then God, it's one of those moments again, right? He was like, God said, if you do this, there's no going back. And then I felt so much despair in that moment, thinking about how angry I was and what I was going to do. And I felt it, and at that time, it felt like it just wasn't me. Like, why was I doing this? Why was I going to do this? And so I stepped back in the cell and I closed the door, and I just felt so broken. Like, God, I don't know what to do. I was just so broken in that moment. But I think it was probably over 6 months, a year of period of time after that, God really started to this healing process, right? And some of that was discovering the root of anger in my life. And it went all the way back to that moment that I shared earlier about my parents on that porch and feeling rejected by them, right? And then taking on the responsibility for all the pain and the trauma that, myself, brother, and sister experienced when it wasn't mine, and I knew, I came to the point where I knew I had to talk to my parents about it. And I felt like the hardest conversation would be with my dad. And And it's crazy because at that point, my dad had been coming to see me every week for years. He would drive no matter where I was at. If it was 3.5 hours away, he would drive every week to come see me. And I was so angry at him, didn't even want to talk to him. I didn't want to see him. But I would go out there and he would go and buy food out of the vending machines and cook it. And he would just sit there next to me and he would hum, worship songs or whatnot. And then after a little while, he would get up and say, I love you, and give me like this side hug. And then he would leave. And then next week he would come back and do the same thing. And, looking back, I can't help but think like the pain that he experienced and wanting to have a relationship with his son, a son who visibly showed anger and hatred towards him every time he tried. And how so often that's how God experiences us, right? In those moments where he's calling us to him and we fight, we resist, but yet he keeps coming. He keeps day after day, year after year. Until finally there's that moment of breakthrough, right? Where we give ourselves to him. And for me, it was that moment of healing where I finally talked to him and I confronted him. And that was the only time I ever seen my dad cry, when he asked me to forgive him.
Yeah.
And then, in that moment, it was like I felt like the anger just released from me.
Yeah.
And I've never experienced anger like that ever again.
Yeah. Yeah, those, as a father, those unintentional words that come out, and generally speaking, they just go somewhere and nothing happens to them.
Yeah.
And then just to hold that, to love your children and to realize that you'd cause some pain, and the only thing you can do is just to ask for forgiveness, which which is what he did. So it's just a human father reaching out. It sounds like you have a good or growing relationship with him. And
yeah, I mean, we have a really good relationship. For me, like, I dream of when it's time for him to retire, and and he needs somebody to care for him. I want to be that person.
Yeah.
To reciprocate that love that he showed me and the care that he showed me, like to give that back. For me, that's important. I love my dad. He's not at all the person that he was. God has totally transformed him, and he's somebody that, I love and admire and respect.
Yes.
And so, yeah, and I'm so great. Again, it goes back to God's promise, right? That I would see his goodness in the land of the living.
Yeah.
And he said, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord, because it's not it's always a process.
Yes.
Right? He's not going to just transform everything all in one day, and I think that's for our good, because through that process we learn to trust him, to rely on him, right? And I think a big thing is he develops this story, this testimony. He entrusts us with that. I don't consider my life and my testimony anything to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
It's something that God has entrusted to me, and to share, and to offer back to him.
And you were talking about this reconciliation with this family.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about?
Yeah. So part of me getting resent into the big part is there was a big push in Michigan some years ago to reform the juvenile justice system. And a large push was made towards juveniles who were sentenced to mandatory life without parole. So regardless of circumstances, you were going to get natural life, right? Or you would go to juvenile. In my case, it would have been 5 years, which I can admit was nowhere near enough that I needed, because it took years, in prison for God to really work a real, a change inside of me, right? And to deal with so many different things. But so it was gaining a lot of publicity. especially in like it was the early 2000s and early to mid 2000s. And I remember a reporter from the Grand Rapids Press came to interview me, and he wanted to talk to me about my story and about the circumstances of the crime and everything like that. And then, he asked me, he was like, well, have you ever heard from the family of the man? And I said, no. And I told him that I had written a letter to them asking for their forgiveness, and never heard anything back. So I wrote another one right after about a year, and never heard anything, and he's like, well, I can tell you that before I came to talk to you, I talked to them, and they told me that they got both of your letters and that they wanted me to tell you that they forgive you. Oh. And when I left that interview and I went back to my cell, there was a letter from them on my bed. Oh. Signed by the whole family. And in it, they expressed that they knew that if their uncle, their brother, their grandfather were there, that, that he would forgive me too. And they told me a little bit about his story, that he was once, he owned a car lot in Lansing, but alcoholism took that from him, and he ended up being homeless and lost all contact with his family for about 2 years. And then a friend of the family, found him sleeping under a bridge in Grand Rapids. And so they got him, and he reconnected him with his family. He went to rehab, and then he just started working in that store and living in the apartment above it when we took his life. And so for me, learning that, it kind of just changed everything for me, just because, and it sounds bad, but the reality is for so often people go to prison, they have guilt and remorse and they experience all of this emotion, right, based on their circumstances. But it's because of their circumstances, because they're in the place they are in life, because of their bad choices, right? And part of that is knowing they may have victimized somebody else, but it's not the same as seeing the consequences, the devastation that you've wrought in somebody else's life when you see them face to face. Because I eventually had a visit with this gentleman's niece, and she wanted me to tell the story of what happened. And after that, and there was even a piece of the story that nobody knew, because I was the getaway driver of the robbery, and nobody knew, and I never shared with anybody that I actually went into the store before the crime, and I seen her uncle face to face before the other two went in and took his life. And I was so torn and so afraid to share that, but I felt like I had to. And I was so afraid that they would hate me and take their forgiveness from me. But I shared it. And when I did, I could see like her heart break, like right in front of my eyes. Like I could see it. And she sat there quiet for a minute, but then said, "I still forgive you." And just having that moment was so different. It impacted me so differently than knowing that I had done something so terrible and that I had hurt people so terribly. To see it with my own eyes was so much deep. And it actually brought some healing as well. I don't know, and to have me try to explain that, I can't. But on a level, it did. But anyway, so years later, when I found myself home again and working in this mission and having that opportunity, it was so important to me because in the face of all these people that I helped and I seen every day, was his face. Yeah. Because that was his story. And this is who he was at one point as well, homeless and struggling with addiction. And, and so to work in that mission was so personal to me. And then again, it's like God using the experience in that story to reach other people, because there's a lot of people that want to do a lot of good and they do different things, and that's awesome, and God uses that. But I feel like God always raises up people who can understand on another level, right? Yeah. And I think that having those people are important as well, right? When reaching certain people, because I feel like I was able to, because of my story, I was able to, reach and help others even in that mission that were really difficult. I remember there was a gentleman who struggled with anger so bad. And I remember sharing some of my story with him. And I remember after another incident where he was going to get kicked out of the mission because of his anger. And, he asked me for help and accountability. And, for me, it meant so much, right? Like, yeah. And, and I worked with him, and, and a big part of his problem was he was so angry, he would get into fights a lot, and then he would lose his job, or he would lose his apartment, things like that because of his anger. And, but there was a point where, working with him and dealing with my own anger and having that experience, being able to help him, that, he eventually left the mission and was able to have his own, a job and sustain all of this, right? And I never seen him back again, and which is awesome. I mean, it's great. But anyway, so, I think that, sorry, now I'm losing my point. Oh,
that's okay. I was really struck by. I was watching you listen to this story, which I think you maybe have heard before, Joy.
There are parts that I haven't heard before. I've heard I would say most of what we've talked about today I've heard, but yeah, there are a few things that I haven't heard.
Well, the part about actually confessing, that's what you were doing with the relatives,
yeah,
and how that made you feel better. I was reminded of a time in my life where I went to a priest and confessed my sins. He was an Anglican priest, so I guess that's okay. But and it was so intense. It was a series of things. He just took me through this rite of confession, and then he basically said, "No, you confess your sins." So then I confessed my sins, in tears. It was really hard. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, he just was like, "Well, you've shown true repentance, and therefore, whatever you feel from now on will be shame, not guilt." And I've thought about that over and over again, and I think about that in relationship to when we actually say what we've done. Mm-hmm. When we say it out loud, we say it out loud to another person. As hard as it is, there's actually something that happens that releases us, yeah, that almost nothing else can. Mm-hmm. And I actually think there's probably a lost art within a lot of our Christian circles, the lost art of confessing our sins one to another. Yeah. We tend to think we don't really do that. Mm-hmm. And so because we don't do that, I think there's times where we're not cleansed, mm-hmm, or we're not fully, recovered.
Yeah. Well, that's what Paul says, right? He mentions in his writing that confess your sins to one another that you may be healed, right?
Right.
And I think that, with that confession comes healing. It comes, there comes release,
right,
from those things. And I feel like that was part of my problem when I talked about, oh my goodness, situational ethics, right?
Yeah.
Some of the way I grew up in prison was that you don't talk about anything like that, right? Because that was bad. That's snitching, right? Like you don't talk about that stuff. You do things, you do bad stuff, you see other people do bad stuff, you keep it quiet. You don't say anything. You keep the secrets, right?
Yeah.
And so that's ingrained in the culture of prison. And that's what I grew up with. And that was something that God had to work out because that is not a part of his plan.
Yeah.
That's not who he is. You see, and so as an example of something that he had to deal with and had to change, and there was a point where he gave me grace in that, right? But then there was the point where the grace ran out.
Yeah.
And then you have to bear the weight of it and the consequences of it. And that was the point where God was like, all right, you got to start. There's some changing, that you got to start doing here, and you got to start dealing with these things. Just for example of, something. And so that I think is the challenge of so many guys and gals in prison, right? In the church, in prison, and that was part of my talk when I went to MCF, about recognizing that and starting to deal with that now.
Yeah.
Right. And starting to realize that, I need to view God apart from the culture of prison.
Yeah.
For how he really is, portrayed in his word, and the truth of his word, of who he is, right? And because that was part of my disillusionment, right? Was, wow, like the way I had experienced God in the past or had imagined and viewed him was not necessarily lining up, right? Like, how come it's not the same now? And it's not because God changed on me, it's because he's like, all right, we got to start stripping some of this stuff away from you.
Yeah. It's just a great story. I think that anybody who's walked down the spiritual life and they have suffered to some degree in the anger, hatred complex, when you were talking about that, like when I was talking about confessing my sins, it has to do with anger that leads to hatred. And I was, the Anglican priest that I was talking with, a good friend of mine, and we both shared this feeling that we had of how anger moved into hatred in ministry. And was very, there was a choice of whether or not we were going to be destroyed by the hatred or not. So anyway, there's probably a lot more that we could say, but I probably need to sort of wind it up. But thanks for coming. We really, I hope that this is the beginning of us kind of relating and helping you guys out and vice versa. Because I think that the story that you told, just even today as you're telling it, it's just been kind of spiritually eye-opening. Like it's made me just kind of realize some things about ministry. And we're going through the Gospel of Mark right now, so it feels like we're right near to the life there in some of the things that he's dealing with and trying to help people to understand why he comes and dies. Yeah. He's not dying for people because they just need a little shove into heaven, right? Because they're just, people are, destroyed and bent and in need of a savior. So anyway, thanks guys. Thanks. I'm going to just wind it up now. So thanks.